will not be recorded or podcasted. No. Yes, it will. Yes, it will. So there's that. And then the final will be a week from today in this room at this time. So if you're watching at home, the final is something you must actually come in for. All right, let's get started. Let's get moving. You know, it's legitimate, it's understandable that for this entire course, this entire 9.5 weeks of the 10-week course, we spend a lot of time focusing on the relationship issues of young adults or midlife adults. That's because you are young adults and I'm a midlife adult. But I wouldn't want to end the course without acknowledging that intimate relationships are not the purview of young adulthood. On the contrary, we are born into relationships. Relationships are part of our intimate relationships between adults are hugely relevant to our lives as infants, to our lives as children, adolescents, certainly young adults, and then on into later life. I like to say relationships are to humans as water is to fish. We live in them. They are the atmosphere that we breathe. The social atmosphere that we breathe is an atmosphere of intimacy and intimate relationships. So, what I want to talk about today, in a really sort of summary way, I mean, you could certainly spend a course on relationships. You could spend 10 weeks just on relationships across a life course. But let's just take a tour, shall we? A sort of quick survey of how intimacy and intimate relationships affect us and are affected by the course of our lives, developmentally speaking. So that's the goal for today. We'll see how far we get. Let's start with young children. You might say, well, young children, how relevant is intimacy to a young child? Young children, I have a young child at home, 7 weeks old today actually, and he can barely lift his head. What's intimacy got to do with him? Well, it turns out that this has been a debate that developmental psychologists have been waging, or have waged, I should say used to wage, for quite a while. And the debate was between people who said, intimacy is so complex that young children are insensitive to it. Young children cannot speak language, so they certainly aren't going to have much to say or much response to whether the adults around them are happy, sad, intimate, close, or distant. That's just not something that young children are capable of processing. At least that's how the argument went. And the implication of that argument, of course, is go ahead and fight in front of your baby. Don't worry about it. They can't tell anything. It turns out, though, that recent research has destroyed that view. That debate has been resolved clearly. And in fact, children from a very young age are incredibly sensitive to the nature of the intimate relationships in the adults around them. They aren't oblivious. Now, they may be oblivious to a lot of things. Children can't process a lot of information. But one thing that they can process very quickly and at a very young age is the nature of the relationships around them. Why would that be true? Well, we talked about attachment theory, which says that children are actually dependent on the relationships in the adults around them. If the adults around them are not doing well, that has survival implications for infants. So it makes sense that infants should care more about those relationships than they do about the letters of the alphabet or lifting their head. So a lot of research has actually looked at young children, not 7 weeks old like my son, but as young as 2 or 3, to see, well, what are they sensitive to? And the way this research, it was interesting, there's an ethical issue here, because you can't really just bring kids in and expose them to their own parents fighting. So the way a lot of this research is done is you bring kids, tiny kids, into the laboratory and expose them to a scripted interaction between adults. Now, you might say, well, no matter how they react to that scripted interaction, the adults are strangers to these kids, so the reactions are not going to be particularly strong. And that's true. Which means that any results that we do find for this kind of design have to be thought of as conservative estimates of the true effect. right? Because if kids are sensitive to things going on in two strangers, think how more sensitive they're going to be to what's going on in their own homes, where they're exposed a lot more frequently to it, and the people that are doing the behavior are people that they depend on. In any case, what they've done is, a guy named Mark Cummings, a developmental psychologist, is responsible for a lot of this work. You don't have to know his name, but if you want to, that's his name. He has two people basically come into a room where children are playing and have an argument, a scripted argument. There are two people who are trained in doing it and making it real. And the question is, how does it affect kids to be exposed to two people arguing and raising their voices at each other? What they find is it has a lot of effects on kids, immediate effects on kids' behavior. Kids show visible signs of agitation. They get more aggressive. They're upset. They're fussier. Babies are fussier. From a very early age, children are affected by being exposed to conflict. Angry voices affect kids from a very early age. But what's interesting is that this research has gone farther than that, because that part is... You'd imagine that those noises are just unpleasant, in the same way that a crying baby is an unpleasant noise to adults. But children are actually sensitive to aspects of that conversation that you'd think really would take quite a lot of processing power. For example, they're affected by whether or not there's a resolution to the conflict. So in some versions of this research, what Cummings did was he had this scripted interaction between these two adults, and in some he randomly assigned the kids to be exposed to either two adults who had an unpleasant interaction, but then they resolved it. They're like, oh, okay, I'm sorry, great. And they sort of had a pleasant resolution. The tension was released between the adults. In contrast to the adults, children were exposed in a second condition to adults who did not resolve their conflict. They got mad, said, okay, well, we'll agree to disagree. They didn't resolve it. Turns out that the children who were exposed to the resolved conflict were happier, less agitated. And the children who were exposed to the same amount of conflict, but it didn't resolve, their negative effects lasted longer. So this is children, at a very young age, I think between 3 and 5. Even more interesting, in my view, is that children are sensitive to these things even if adults are trying to hide it. I love this research. Because you can imagine adults who are mad at each other, but there are kids around, or an audience of children around, trying to sort of hide the conflict. Like putting on a forced smile or saying, honey, I know the kids are watching, but that really irritates me a lot what you just did, or something like that. You can imagine people thinking, well, as long as I don't show anything or suppress my real emotions, the kids won't pick it up. That's not the case. Mark Cummings did that. In this case, it was with videos. So they manipulated the videos so that some of the kids watched a conflict that didn't get resolved, a conflict between two adults that didn't get resolved, but the adults had a positive affect, or at least they avoided negative affect. The other condition had children exposed to a conflict that didn't get resolved, but the adults had a negative affect. Compared to conflicts that did get resolved, children in both of those conditions did worse. In other words, children were sensitive to the fact that it was a conflict that didn't get resolved, even if the adults tried to put a positive spin on it. Kids saw right through that. They knew, no, you didn't solve that problem. So children are witnesses. Their eyes are wide open, and they're not insensitive to even quite complicated interactions between the adults around them. So that's sort of what I mean by humans are fish swimming in an ocean of intimate relationships. For children, they're surrounded by the relationships of the adults around them from a very early age, and it has an impact. Well, the question is, what impact? Why do these adult relationships matter so much for kids? There's a couple reasons. Theories distinguish between how the kids understand, how do young children understand conflict between the adults around them. And a lot of times we're imagining conflict between the parents of this child, but it doesn't have to be the parents. In the modern world that we live in, not every child is raised by two biological parents, and it doesn't matter. The point is that no matter whether the child is being raised by a single parent or adoptive parent or two biological parents, children are exposed to adults who have relationships. And when they are exposed to conflict between those adults, research distinguishes between primary appraisals and secondary appraisals. What's the difference? Primary appraisal, the word appraisal is like an understanding of the experience. Primary appraisal is when the kids say of the experience, is this a threat to me? Primary appraisal is like your initial survival appraisal. Threat or no threat? You can see why that would be primer. Like in animals, in humans, in every organism, your first thing you have to understand is this something that is going to threaten my life or not? Well, you can imagine that the effect of an adult conflict on the kid will be a function of that kid's primary appraisal. In other words, if the kid says, my parents or these adults are fighting, that might be a threat to me, which seems like not an unreasonable appraisal to reach. That makes the kid's emotions more extreme. So children have a more extreme emotional reaction to conflict in the adults around them, depending if they make a primary appraisal of threat. And you can see that's an easy appraisal to make. So you can imagine that if you are waiting for mom to bring you food, can't feed yourself, you're just two, and suddenly your mom is distracted by a fight with another adult in the house, maybe your dad, maybe a boyfriend, maybe something else. That's a threat to you. Because now someone's getting in between your parent and the care that that parent needs to give you. A lot of research shows that the more that children perceive a threat, that predicts difficulties with emotion regulation later in life. In other words, children who are in a threatening environment are more emotionally reactive, and that carries on to later life. But that's just the primary appraisal. The secondary appraisal is, why is this happening? Once I've evaluated if it's a threat or not, the secondary appraisal is sort of a next level, which is, what's going on? Why is this happening? And what can I do about it? That's the secondary appraisal. And a lot of research, some interesting models of the effects of adult conflict on kids, suggest that the effect of that conflict on the kid's intimate relationships later in life will depend on the kind of secondary appraisals the kids make. In other words, is this something that has to do with me? So the way research sort of talks about this is like this. Some kids answer the question, why is this happening? With the answer, it's happening because of me. Right? That's the sort of stereotype of the child of divorced parents who says to him or herself, oh, it's my fault. I caused this conflict. They're fighting because of me. Now, and sometimes the child is right. You can imagine if you're a child and you're exposed to parents arguing about parenting, the child might say, oh, they're arguing about me. But even if the child is wrong, you can imagine children saying, well, I must have done this somehow. And they've actually studied this. They studied this by asking kids, young kids, even as young as 5, can answer a question, what do you think about when you were exposed to this kind of conflict? Turns out that kids who blame themselves, that has long-lasting effects on their self-concept and their self-esteem. Kids who feel to blame, that becomes a habit, and that sort of shapes kids from an early age to think, I may not be lovable. And it overlaps with attachment theory. We're talking about how children's working models of self develop. Other kids, by the way, might come up with a different appraisal, a different secondary appraisal, which is, okay, what does this mean? It means that they need to be fixed, and it's my job to fix it. So there's observational research showing that there's a pattern of response. Some children respond to conflict in their parents by making trouble to distract them. You can imagine the situation. Two adults are fighting in the next room. The little child says, how do I make this stop? How do I make this stop? This is so frustrating. Maybe if I knock over a vase, maybe I'll try that. I'm frustrated, I knock over the vase. And guess what happens when I knock over the vase? They stop fighting. And they come in like, hey, you knocked over the vase. And now they're mad at me, but they're not mad at each other. That becomes reinforcing. And there's research showing that that becomes a habit. And that's one route by which adult relationships lead to behavior problems in kids. Through that route. Through the reinforcement of, oh, behavior problems actually become a great way of controlling the adults around me. And maybe even helping them. So there's a difference between the effects of adult relationships on emotion regulation, my ability to sort of manage my distress, and the effect of adult relationships on my self-concept and sort of my habits of how I'm supposed to behave, how I think I'm supposed to behave in the world. And that raises a third issue, which is, do children get used to it? Or do they get sensitized? So the word sensitization means your reaction gets bigger the more you're exposed to something. So you imagine, like, that comes from sort of allergy research, that if your first bee sting is bad, your second bee sting you respond even worse, and every time you get a bee sting you have a worse response. That's sensitization. Desensitization is the opposite. Your response is weaker the more you're exposed. So you can imagine, the question with kids is, do children who are exposed to a lot of conflict between their parents, do they become desensitized? Do they become numb to it? Or do they become, sensitized? Is it that it gets worse and worse the more you're exposed to it? Well, I don't think there's a definitive answer to this question, but some research by Mark Cummings, who's kind of the leader in this, did an experiment where he brought kids into the research rooms, and what he did was he had kids playing with each other. And he had two human beings, a man and a woman, come into the room. They were research assistants, and they were pretending to be what they were, research assistants. And then they had a scripted interaction. They'd come into the room once and have a neutral interaction, then leave the room. Then they'd come into the room again and have an argumentative interaction, then leave the room. Then come back, but their interaction was something like, hey, weren't you supposed to clean up these cups after we gave the cups to the kids? No, you were supposed to clean up the cups. No, I thought you were supposed to clean up the cups. It was that kind of thing. And then they came back and had a neutral interaction. And then they came back a fourth time and had another conflict interaction. Now, in between each of these exposures, the kids continued to play in a room with, as you would imagine, one-way mirrors on one wall. And on the other side of those one-way mirrors were observers who were looking for examples of aggressive behavior in the kids. Here's what they found. After the first exposure to the adult conflict, aggressive behaviors in the kids went up. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you that of course there are two conditions. One in which the kids were exposed twice and one in which the kids were exposed only once. So the kids were exposed once to conflict in the adults, their aggressive behavior went up. Suddenly they're there playing in the room and the observers noticed, wow, a real big uptick in the amount of punching or kicking or hair pulling or fighting over toys after they've been exposed to a conflict interaction between adults. The adults didn't draw attention to themselves necessarily. I mean, they didn't say like, hey kids, watch us. They were just in the room, but it still had an effect. Micah. The way the second group went is they were exposed, I think that's true, but the details are in the reader, but I think the second group was invited in later. So both groups were exposed to the second interaction, but only one group was exposed to the first interaction, if you know what I mean. So one group got a first interaction, and then there was a second interaction, and another group joined for the second one, so they only got that second one. And the question is, but everyone got a neutral interaction to compare. So the question is the difference between the kids' behavior when they were exposed to neutral, and the kids behave when they're exposed to the conflict. Here's the point. They found clear evidence of sensitization. The kids who were exposed twice were way more aggressive after the second exposure than they were to the first exposure. Sensitization, not desensitization. It wasn't that after the second time, it's not that the second time had a less big effect, the second time had a bigger effect. Well, again, that's strangers in a laboratory twice. So imagine the effects of living in a house with people who are experiencing conflict. The effects will be extremely bad. I mean, and that's the truth. Adult relationships matter hugely for kids because they're so dependent on the nature of those relationships in so many ways. So the effects are, there's many paths, many routes through which adult relationships affect kids. But that's not the only relationship. That's not the only relationship that affects the development of intimacy in lives. 90% of us have siblings. Raise your hand if you have a sibling. Well, that's about 90%. Something interesting. Sibling relationships are a real puzzle. They haven't received a lot of research, I'll tell you that. Now, in this lecture, we're interested in sibling relationships as predictors of our adult intimate relationships. But there's something interesting about siblings, which is, if you ask kids about all the relationships they have in their life, and then say, in which relationships do you fight the most? Kids fight more with their siblings than with any other relationship in their entire lives. By the way, do you sort of resonate to that? All of you sibling people? Like, who in your life, that maybe you have a great relationship with your siblings, and I hope you do. But who in your life do you fight with the most, or particularly as children? Siblings fight with each other more than they fight with friends. More than they fight with strangers, more than they fight with their parents. Siblings argue, they fight. Why should that be true? It's an interesting question because let me give you the argument why it shouldn't be true. Siblings are similar to each other. They're more similar than strangers. They're familiar to each other. Think of the rules of attraction that we learned. They're proximal to each other. They're near each other. They share genes. They probably share somewhat more similar values than people in other cultures, or than the house down the street. And they have common interests. They have a common investment in peace in the family. So why wouldn't siblings be the closest relationships ever? Raise your hand if you are close to your sibling. Oh, that's not bad. By the other hand, you're a little older. Or raise your hand if you experience conflict with your sibling as a younger child. Okay, me too, bud. So the question is why? That's sort of puzzling. Why should this relationship that should be close throughout, there's no reason why they should ever not be close, now is in fact, in childhood, a source of a lot of conflict for kids? Well, the evolutionary psychologists step in and say, we can understand this. And the evolutionary psychologists say, here's why. Because siblings only share 50% of their genes. So if they're competing for resources, their interests are not the same necessarily. Genetically speaking, I want to protect my genes, and 50% of my genes you don't share, sibling. So we don't always have common interests. And in fact, we're competing for something, which is parental attention. So again, the evolutionary psychologist says this, and says, if there's scarce resources, and I know my parent has to choose who to devote resources to, then I'm actually competing with my sibling for those scarce resources. My parent has an equal investment in both of us. My parent shares genes with both of us, and my parent says, well, I want my genes that are in this kid to survive, and I want my genes that are in this kid to survive, so I want to give equal to both of them. But the sibling says, I don't care about your genes that much. I share 100% of my own genes, and I only share 50% of your genes, so I want more for me than you get. See that? The parents have an equal investment in all kids. But siblings don't. Siblings have an equal investment only in themselves, and they have less investment in their sibling. So that's why there's tension, at least from the evolutionary perspective. Was there a question back? What's your name? Whitney. Yes? Do they? Are you an identical twin? Anyone? You're an identical twin? How's that going? You're best friends and you fight a lot. That's interesting. Micah? That's great. So Micah says, wait a minute. I mean, couples fight because they're intimate with each other. The closer you are with someone, the more opportunities there are for conflict. That's the reason why siblings should fight too, because they're very close. They have more opportunities for conflict. It's an excellent point. And yet the evolution, it's totally true, by the way. This is not a complete answer to why siblings fight at all. And yet it has a very interesting implication that's kind of unique to siblings, which is that siblings should be uniquely sensitive to differential parental treatment. If siblings are indeed really in competition from a survival perspective for parental resources and attention, then they should have evolved sensitivity to that competition. And when there's more competition, that should be really harmful for sibling relationships. And indeed it is. So first of all, there's observational research. Observational research where they go into homes and observe how parents allocate resources across siblings. And they've shown that the more there's differential parental treatment, that's a phrase worth writing down, differential parental treatment, the more of that is observed in the home, the worse the relationship between the siblings. And that makes sense. Micah. It's a good question. I don't know. It's a darn good question. So Micah asked the question, but I'm not going to repeat it since I don't know the answer. An experimental study that sort of looks at this sensitivity. Okay? An experimental study that looks at just how sensitive are kids to the issue of differential treatment. I think it's a very clever design. Here's how they did it. They got infants, babies, and their moms to come to the lab. Two conditions. They wanted to observe how distressed the baby gets under two conditions. So they had some kind of observational coding system of baby distress. By the way, I would not be able to do this research. I can watch couples arguing, but I cannot watch babies crying. But in this research, you'd watch a lot of babies crying. So in one case, well, in both cases, the mothers were, in both conditions of the experiment, mothers were instructed to neglect their child for a minute or two, to put down their child and not respond. Okay? So the question is, how upset did this baby get when the mother has been told, don't respond for a minute or two? Here's the question. Here's the manipulation. In one condition, while they were not responding, the mothers were told to read a book. They said, Mom, read this book and don't respond to your kids. So the kids could see you reading a book and not responding. In the second condition, the mothers were told to not respond and spend their non-response time interacting with a lifelike baby doll. Now, in both cases, the kid is getting the exact same amount of attention, 0. But in one case, the mom is reading a book instead of taking care of the kid. In the other case, the mom is googling and cooing to a baby-like object that isn't the kid. Now, this is infants now, but what they saw is that the kids were sensitive not only to being neglected, no kid likes to be neglected, but to why they were being neglected. The kids got much more upset when they were being neglected for another baby than for a book, suggesting that at a very young age, children are sensitive to this issue of differential treatment. Like, hey, don't neglect me, parents, but really don't neglect me for my sibling. Kind of interesting. So this is independent of Micah's point, which is, well, sure, but there's many other reasons why siblings should have conflict. But this is kind of interesting one from evolutionary psychology. So what? Is that important? It actually turns out to be super important. There's a lot of research on sort of the development of intimacy in people who do and don't have siblings. Turns out that siblings are really important for promoting something called theories of mind. Now, I'm not a developmental psychologist, and this isn't a developmental psychology course, but if you've taken developmental psychology, you probably are familiar with this phrase, the idea of theories of mind. And theories of mind is my own theory about the existence of an inner mental life in other human beings. That's my own summary of that phrase. So to the extent that I have developed a theory of mind, it's that I understand that you have a mental life independent of mine. Does that make sense? Young, very, very young children, like 2 or 3, do not have a theory of mind. And what that means is they think that if I perceive something, then you perceive it too. It's adorable. So small children, of course, think, why is peekaboo a fun game for a kid? Because they think that if they can't see you, then you can't see them. Like, oh, I'm hiding from you. You can't see me. Oh, now you can see me. Well, that implies I do not have a theory of mind. Theory of mind would be like, oh, even though I can't see you, I understand that you can still see me. You can imagine that developing a theory of mind is one of the first building blocks to being capable of having an intimate relationship. Because as we've talked about so many times in this course, one of the foundations of an intimate relationship, of a successful intimate relationship, is understanding your partner's perspective. It's acknowledging and validating your partner's inner mental life. Well, the development of a theory of mind is a step towards being able to do that. It turns out that people with siblings develop theories of mind earlier than people who are only children. I'm not saying that you're out of luck, only children. I'm just saying that it happens earlier for people with siblings. And we'll talk about why in a second. Question, I forgot your name. Deja, right. Okay, Deja takes us back to this issue of differential parental treatment and asks, what if there's an obvious reason for differential parental treatment? Is that also associated with conflict? And the answer is no. So for example, I have an older daughter who's 7.5 years old, and now a 7-week-old son. Well, we don't treat them the same. It's not a problem. She gets it. She's like, oh yeah, you're treating me different than him because we're very, 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 very different. It's when kids are closer in age that becomes more of the differential parental treatment is more of an issue because there's less of an obvious salient reason for the differential treatment. Did I answer your question? Super. But Deja, your sort of point leads to this next point, which is that conflict can be good. A little conflict can be good. Why? Because it teaches us theories of mind. If you have someone around that you have to resolve problems with, like a sibling, like, who's going to get the last slice of cake? Who's going to play with that toy? Who's going to unwrap this gift? The successful negotiation requires understanding, you are mad at me. You know things that I don't know. You have an inner life that's independent of my inner life. If you don't have those experiences, there's no one around to have conflict with, and your conflict with parents is a totally different thing. Because parents don't have conflict with little kids. They just say, I'm the dad, and this is what's happening. But when you have a sibling around and have some conflict, now, I'm not talking about hostile conflict. I'm not talking about, abuse between siblings, which happens. I'm talking about, in the context of an overall positive relationship, having disagreements helps to produce theories of mind, which is a building block of adult intimacy. That's my point. How is this tested? It's tested in a way that I find so charming I want to tell you about. It's called the false belief test. You might have heard of it if you've taken developmental psychology. The false belief test, well, it looks like this. Here's the false belief test. I don't know if you can read this, so I'll read it to you. It's also called the Sally-Ann test. This is Sally, and this is Ann. Sally has a basket, Ann has a box. Sally has a marble. It's a big marble because Sally's very small. She puts the marble into her basket. There it is. See her putting it in the basket? And here's Anne. She's just happy to be there. Sally goes out for a walk. See you, Sally? And here's Anne, still very happy. But then Anne, here's why she's so happy. Anne takes the marble, while Sally's gone, takes the marble out of Sally's basket and puts it in her box. But Sally doesn't see this happen, right? Because Sally's out for a walk. Now Sally comes back. And she's looking for her marble. She hasn't looked yet. She just wants to, she says, oh, that marble, I like it very much. I would like to see it again. Here's the question for you. Okay, extra credit. Where does she look for the marble? Is that, you sure? That's good, because by about the age of 5, most people can get this right. About the age of 5, most people understand that Sally has no reason to look anywhere but here. This is where she put it. She didn't see anyone move it. So as far as she knows, it's still in there. That's a false belief, though. We know that it's not in there. So if we understand, if we recognize that we have information that Sally lacks, that is a theory of mind. That's acknowledging that we can understand something that Sally doesn't understand. At less than 5, on average, at less than 5, kids don't get that distinction. So very small children, 3- and 4-year-old children, on average will say, well, the marble's in here. So she's going to look in here, obviously. Not understanding that she wasn't around when the marble got switched. After 5, and you college students seem to do a great job with this, you figured out that Sally is going to look here because Sally doesn't have the information that you have. Sally didn't witness what you witnessed. Sally didn't witness the trickster Anne messing up the situation. So that's just a situation. I mean, this is a very commonly used test. And they've shown in a number of studies that children with siblings get this quicker. And it makes perfect sense. Because children with siblings are in the situation a lot. Right from an early age. If you've got, particularly if you've got siblings that are close to you in age, if you're 3 or 4 and you've got a kid that's 1 or 2 running around, you may well not find your marble in that basket when you get back to it. Because Anne may have moved around. So kids do solve this test correctly quicker when they have siblings, because siblings teach us how to deal with other people in an intimate, close way. And that is one of the building blocks of intimacy. But it's not the only one. Next, we got friendships. Friendship's kind of interesting. Because friendships are the first voluntary relationship. It's the first relationship that we choose. We don't get to choose our siblings, or our parents, or aunts or cousins, but friends we can choose. It's the first time that we're going to have that opportunity, which of course will then become a choice we're going to make in later life to be intimate with somebody. So what does that choice do for us? Well, the experience of playing with friends also helps us to develop these intimate capacities. And in particular, people have focused on the role of shared imaginative play. What's really useful about friends, that's sort of unique, I mean siblings do this too, of course, is the ability to inhabit a shared imaginary world together. Think about kids saying, okay, this is a rocket ship, and I'm the captain, and you're gonna be the first mate. And the other person says, wait, no, there's a revolution. Now I'm the captain. The point being that they get the rules of the game. Kids, when they're playing together, are saying, we have developed an understanding between the two of us that we are sharing. Well, that is what an intimate relationship ultimately is going to be, is that we're going to decide this is our consensus home, this is our intimate life, and there are some rules, and we both understand what they are. The capacity to develop that shared space, that shared understanding, and that's a unique understanding, and it's an understanding that emerges. Well, that capacity starts with friendships. That's not the only thing that friendships do. Friendships are a source of working models of the self and other. A new source. So this is back to attachment theory. This is strongly related to attachment theory. So think about it. Attachment theory says you learn from your primary caregiver, often a mother or a father. You learn about what's the world like socially, and what do you like socially. You learn, oh, I'm a person of, like my kid believes that the sun rises and sets when she says so. Because everyone she meets says very, very positive things directly to her. I'm glad that she feels that way. But the point is that when she goes outside the house and she meets people that are not members of the family, that's an opportunity to get new messages. Messages that may well change what you think about yourself. So we talked about attachment theory. Attachment theory says that your models of self and other are pretty stable, but they can be changed. And the emergence from the house into the social world of friendships is an opportunity for change to happen. And people have studied this in kind of there's a really interesting way that people have studied the effect of friendships on people's self-concept. And it's a process called sociometric testing. Sociometric testing is mostly done in school settings. That's a great, you don't have to do it in school settings, but it's often done in school settings because there's a lot of kids in small groups. And what you need to do sociometric testing is to have kids in small groups. And here's how it's done. You take every kid and you give them a list of every other kid in the room, in the classroom, let's say. And you say, put a circle around all the kids you like in this room. And put a square around all the kids that you don't like in this classroom. That's it. That's all you do. You give them a list, you say circle the ones you like, or put a blue line over, indicate which ones you like, and indicate who you don't like. And you realize that that's not going to be a comprehensive list. There are going to be some kids that are not in any way, that I don't like, it's not that I like them or dislike them, they're just not on the list. Well, I don't have any feelings for them. The researchers will take that data and then calculate for each kid, for each individual, how many people like that individual, how many people dislike that individual. So each kid will get a score. A liking score of how many likes I received from my peers, and how many dislikes I received from my peers. And that kind of data has been used to identify 4 different profiles of young children in school settings. It's a way of quantifying your social status. And it's quantified in these 4 profiles. Let's talk about them, because it turns out that where you are categorized from an early age has implications for the rest of your life, I'm sorry to say. So, for example, some kids are popular. Who are popular kids? The kids that are liked by a lot of their peers and rarely disliked. So they got a lot of likes, they got a lot of votes for like, and very few dislikes. Those are the popular kids. But guess what? I'm sorry to say, because the word popular has this sort of a negative connotation, at least it does for me. The popular kids are, snobby or whatever. Well, it turns out it's great to be popular. Popular kids do terrific the rest of their lives. So if you weren't popular, you're like, oh, well, you'll suffer later. Wrong. They will not suffer later. Popular kids are very successful forever. I'm not saying it always, but by and large, super rockin' great to be popular. I can go through the details, but you get the idea that if you're liked by your peers at an early age, well, you do better in school, you do better socially, you have better intimate relationships later, you have more friends, better friends, deeper friends, and you have a great life. Rejected people are the people who have very few likes and lots of dislikes. Everyone in the class dislikes them and very few people like them. Megan? Yeah, I bet. In fact, I think that would suck, but I don't know the details. But yeah, I think absolutely it can affect you. We'll talk about that in a moment. More vulnerable? That's a great question, Megan. I'm not an expert. My knowledge in this is not deep, so I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question. If you have a change in status, a change in categorization, does it help to have been popular, or does it make it worse? It's a great question. I don't know the answer. Worth studying. Very worth studying. Please pursue that as a career. Heidi? What's that? Well, they found them in small groups, like a classroom. They asked them the questions individually and privately. So imagine you're in this classroom of 30 kids. I give you a sheet. It's a class roster. I just say, circle the likes, square the dislikes. No, of course. No, it's totally private. So that's the popular kids. The rejected kids are the kids who are disliked by their peers and liked by few peers. So high dislikes, low likes. They do very badly. Kids who are rejected at an early age, for whatever reason, are highly at risk for behavioral problems, for having few friends and being isolated later in life, and for having more difficulty with intimacy. That's just true. I don't know exactly. So that's bad news. These are the sort of interesting ones. Controversial are the kids who are liked by a lot of kids and disliked by a lot of kids. Controversial kids get a lot of likes and a lot of dislikes. These kids tend to be sort of bold kids that some kids gravitate to and other kids sort of reject. And the question is, what's interesting is to compare the controversial with rejected and the popular. Controversial have a lot of people who like them, like the popular, but they also have a lot of people that dislike them, like the rejected. So what happens? Are they more similar to the rejected, or are they more similar to the popular? Answer: they're more similar to the popular. Having people that like you protects you from having a lot of people dislike you. Now, they have some issues. These people don't have it as easy as the purely popular, but they do better than the rejected by a long shot. And then there's the neglected. Those are the kids that don't appear on any lists. The kids that don't have a lot of dislikes or likes. They're shy. They're withdrawn, and indeed, they grow up and have evidence of being shy and withdrawn. They start relationships later. They have fewer friends. So this is kind of just there's an elegance to this as a design. Now, there's lots of, as Megan points out, there's lots of questions you can ask about this, and I think there's a lot of research that uses this method. This is a huge literature that does sociometric testing. But it's worth knowing about. And for our purposes, it's interesting that how you are coming across in early childhood has implications for later life. So these capacities for intimacy are continuous. And then you get to adolescence. Well, if becoming friends is an opportunity to learn new things about intimacy and about attachment, imagine the transition in adolescence, because the transition is this. Adolescence is when people experience their first romantic love. May not happen. I'm not talking about sex here. I'm talking about your first crush, your first sort of romance, your first sort of feeling like, oh, I like you, I really like you. That happens for most human beings in adolescence. Even 9-year-old kids know what intimate relationships are like because you're surrounded by them. Again, you can't escape them. They're not only in your own house, but they're everywhere you look. They're in every media. They're in every book you've ever read. So 9-year-old kids know all about intimate relationships and what to expect from them. By 6th grade, kids want relationships. But now there's big cultural differences here. So there's big differences between blacks and whites, between Asians and whites and blacks, in terms of the age at which people say, no, I want a girlfriend or a boyfriend right now. But on average, in the United States, by 6th grade, kids are pointing it out. Like they're like, when am I going to have a partner? And it's a big transition because it's basically a transition from your primary source of emotional security being inside the house to your primary source of emotional security being outside the house. Well, that's a big leap. And you can imagine it's fraught with danger. Because inside the house, there's all sorts of people that are invested in your future. So there's many reasons why people inside the house should want to protect you emotionally. Outside the house, you're on your own. There's a lot more room for danger, emotional danger. And yet that's what happens. As I say, I used to be tied the deepest feelings I had were for my family members, and now, in adolescence, suddenly I have the deepest feelings for someone outside the house. Well, what are the consequences of that transition? There are a lot of consequences of that transition, enormous consequences. Breakups in adolescence trigger the onset of major depression for a lot of people. So people who in their lives have a history of major depression, first onset is frequently in adolescence when a relationship breaks up. And then that becomes not your last onset of major depression. And of course, adolescents are perfectly capable of becoming pregnant, getting STDs. Adolescent relationships have surprisingly high rates of violence, physical violence. So, I mean, we're adolescents. I'm talking like people that are, I don't know how old you were, but people like, you know, we're talking about 11, 12, 13-year-old young adolescents are in substantial percentages experiencing this stuff. Well, you can imagine concretely these things have implications for your life. If you get pregnant, that changes your life. If you have an STD, that changes your life. But it has other implications for adult relationships. Longitudinal research that has looked at adolescents and the kind of relationship they have shown people who are fighting with their adolescent partners are more likely to fight with their adult partners. So already in adolescence, we see people on the path to the kind of intimacy that they're going to have throughout their life. Is it capable of change? Of course. But there's substantial continuity as well, and it's in place by adolescence. Okay, so now you're growing up. Let's skip some things, skip college. We get to the issue of cohabitation. So now we're talking not about dating, we're talking about establishing a home. I could have talked about marriage here, but I'm interested in the transition into cohabitation, partly because over 50% of married couples live together first in the United States. And married couples usually live together, so this is a big transition. From someone you love to someone you're establishing a household with. In the United States, cohabitation is normative. Most couples live together before they get married. But most couples who live together don't get married. You see the difference. If you look at the group that is married, most of them live together. But if you look at the group that's living together, most of them do not go on to get married. Most of cohabiting relationships break up before they transition into marriage. Now, there's been a lot of research and a lot of discussion of the effects of cohabitation on your later relationship. Is it good to live together? Let's say you're planning on getting married. Is it good to live together? Is it bad to live together? Does it have an effect? A lot of this research is driven by ideology. The fact is, generalizations about the effects of cohabitation are very hard to make definitively. Why? There's two reasons why. One is, there's a huge selection effect into cohabitation. The people who choose to cohabit are quite different from the people who do not choose to cohabit. And those differences may drive differences in later relationships, regardless of whether cohabitation itself causes anything. A second reason why it's really hard to talk about the effects of cohabitation is that there's at least 4 different types of cohabitors. The phenomenon of living together, sharing a household, without being married, is a complicated phenomenon. It's not just one thing. In fact, it's at least 4 different things. So, almost half of people who live together are engaged or pre-engaged. In other words, these are couples who say, yeah, we're going to get married, we're totally on the way to get married, but since we know we're getting married, either, in July, or we're going to get married next year, we just haven't gotten engaged yet, if you know we're going to get married, then we're like, you know what, let's stop paying 2 rents. Let's just start living together now, and then we'll get the wedding. It takes a while to get a wedding. If you've ever gotten married, there's so many details. So these are cohabitors that it's not like they're living together as a lifestyle choice. It's that they're living together because they're on their way to getting married. And they're just, might as well start living together first so we don't have to sign another lease in the apartment. In contrast, there's another large group of co-residential daters. Co-residential daters are not engaged. They're not pre-engaged. They are not talking about marriage. They're just dating. But for one reason or another, they're sharing a residence. I often see this among college students, actually. It's just easier for us to be in each other's space all the time. That doesn't mean we're getting married necessarily, but for one reason or another, it's convenient. Co-residential daters aren't always even monogamous. So you imagine the level of commitment. It's totally different here versus here. Then there's the group that's in a trial marriage, that calls themselves a trial marriage. This is the group that says, well, we're not engaged, we want to see what it would be like. So we're living together to see if we want to get engaged. And if it works out, then we'll consider getting engaged. These people are thinking about marriage. They're not as committed as these people, but perhaps a little bit more committed than these people. Then there's a very small group. 90% of the people are here. 10% of the people are in what's called a substitute marriage. These are people who say, for example, a good friend of mine, reject the institution of marriage. I do not wish to get married. We will never get married, but we plan to live together forever. We're totally committed to each other. We absolutely plan to be together forever, but we don't ever plan to get married. I think that the actress Goldie Hawn and Ken Russell, what's that? Kurt Russell. I think that they have been together forever, but they are not married. And they even have kids, but they're not married. I would call that a substitute marriage. Hey, you know who else? Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins. They are not married, but they totally are, been together forever. They'd probably call it a substitute marriage. Micah? This research was done, I don't remember the population. I don't remember the population. I think this is mostly heterosexual relationships. Good question. Desha? People who have children out of wedlock? No, I mean, that's an independent issue, it seems to me, Desha. So you can have children out of wedlock and still be engaged. You can have children out of wedlock and still be in a trial marriage. You can have children out of wedlock and be co-residential daters. You can have children out of wedlock and say, and we plan to be together forever in this cohabiting relationship. It's an independent issue. So cohabitation, the point is that these groups, research that has divided up cohabitors among these groups finds that they're quite different from each other. So who knows what the effect of cohabitation is? Question anyone who says, oh, cohabitation has this effect, because there's different types of cohabitation. That's what you need to know. All right. So then, you're in that relationship, you're together, you've established a household, now you're an adult, and you're getting older. Well, this is sort of where we've spent most of our time this 9 weeks so far. What happens to that relationship? Well, sex declines over time between two people who are in a long-term monogamous relationship. And it reminds me of the penny jar story. Anyone know the story? A friend of mine, college student of mine, is a Mormon. And what they told him, now Mormons do not have, absolutely no sex before marriage. And he assured me that he is abiding by all the rules. So what they told him is this: if you get a newlywed couple who has saved themselves for marriage, have not had sex until marriage, and you instruct them to put a penny in a jar by the bed every time they have sex during the first year of the marriage, and then you instruct them to take a penny out of the jar every time they have sex subsequent to the first year of marriage. What the saying goes in Mormon culture, that the jar will never be emptied. Oh, with the idea being, of course, that first year sees quite a lot of activity and a significant drop-off in activity subsequent to the first year. Well, I don't know of anyone who has tested this theory, and I haven't gone back and asked my college roommates, but the evidence is clear that sexual frequency does decline over time. It doesn't mean it drops to zero. Just within one relationship, it declines. Maybe you start really high and you just go a little bit low. That's okay. Positivity also declines, though. So long-term research that has evaluated how much positivity in the relationship and how much negativity in the relationship, over and over and over again over the course of 10, 15 years, shows that the real change, hold on one second, the real change happens in positivity. Positivity tends to decline. People are less affectionate, less hugs, less dates over time. Negativity doesn't stay the same. Now, of course, we've talked about satisfaction over time declines in long-term relationships. What's your name? Dana.
I have a question about the sex. Is it marriage or is it just how long is it together? Because I know everyone always, the reason people always talk about once you're married.
Yeah. I think it's how long you're together is the key issue here.
Okay, so marriage has no sex.
I'm not sure. I think the data come mostly from married couples. But I have not heard any theory that suggests there's something unique about married couples. It's that any long-term monogamous relationship, you're going to see the frequency of sex decline. Okay, so now you've been together for a long time. Sex has declined, your positivity has declined, your satisfaction has declined, but guess what? You're lucky. Started out high, so you're still doing okay. And now you're in what we call later life. What's intimacy like then? Now we have a lot of myths about later life. A lot of stereotypes about later life. That, oh, you know, people dry up, or intimacy goes away, or passion goes away, or people now they're more interested in their stamp collections. Let's blow a hole in some of those myths, because almost all of them are false. Intimacy, the need for intimacy, the need for passionate intimacy doesn't go away. It's part of the human condition. It's part of the human condition. You don't grow out of it. You don't age out of it. It's part of being human. So as long as you're alive and human, you need intimacy. After 60, but here's the fact, because if that's true, I just said, and it is. This is also true. After 65, men are nearly twice as likely to be married than women. Twice as likely to be married than women. Why is that? In midlife, since men and women tend to marry each other in most states, there are 50% of, the exact same numbers of men and women are married. But by 65, men are twice as likely to be married. Why? Wyatt? Men die sooner, leaving behind unmarried women. And, Heidi? More dependent on women as they get older, which leads to another phenomenon, Wyatt? Exactly. So it all fits together. So what Wyatt and Heidi said together is that men die sooner, leaving behind more women without partners, and men, because they're very dependent in later life on women, remarry quicker than women. So there's fewer men, and they tend to remarry. Women, there's more women, and they have a lower chance of remarrying, so there's more of them living unmarried or as widows later in life. Dana? That contributes. So Dana says, what about the fact that older men are considered desirable and older women are not stereotypically considered desirable? And that contributes to the fact that men are more likely to remarry even later in life. So when men lose their wives at a late age, they remarry someone younger. And then they've got wisdom, resources that they can offer to a younger spouse. But older women tend not. Experiences with intimacy in early life have consequences for what your later life is like. So there's a huge literature on this. I don't want to belabor the point. But guess what? If you've been divorced at any time in your life, it has consequences for later life. The more times you've been married in your life, the poorer and the less healthy you are in later life. I'm talking about after 55, after 65. There are health consequences for the experience of divorce. Even if the divorce happened 25 years ago, people are still feeling the effects in terms of their health and their financial well-being in later life. So the point is this. We imagine, or I don't know about you, but there is a stereotype of older adults kind of settled. They are either alone, playing bridge, or they're in a relationship sitting on the porch, rocking the two of them next to each other. But the fact of the matter is that intimacy is just as complicated and active in older adults as it is in young adults, because people are dying, because people are still divorcing. You have older adults are dating, they're living together, they're shacking up, and they're remarrying. Even in late life. It doesn't end. Here's another thing they're doing. They are having sex. And let's take a moment to contemplate sexuality in later life. I want you to see these graphs. I want you to take a good look at these graphs and think about what they mean. Let's take a look here. The dependent variable is the percentage of sexually active adults in the last 12 months. So the question is, were you sexually active in the last 12 months? Okay? Among 57 to 64-year-olds, 84% of men said, yeah, I've been sexually active in the last 12 months, and less women. Among 65 to 74-year-old men, 66% of them have been sexually active in the last 12 months. Among 75 to 85-year-old men, 38% of them have been sexually active in the last month. I don't know what the percentage is for college students, but it's got to be comparable. But let's get even further. Let's ask, percentage of sexually active people having sex over 2 to 3 times per month. Now the question is, are you, not just did you have sex last year, but are you getting some regularly? Now take a look at this. See, in the last year, many more men are having sex than women because many more men have partners than women. But of the people that are having sex, men and women, of the people who are having sex, men and women are having similar amounts of sex. And so this is just the people that are having sex. They're having sex with some regularity. I mean, we're talking about 68%, 64%, men are 75 to 85-year-old men and women. I'm going to say that again. 75 to 85-year-old men and women, according to this survey, are having sex more than 2 to 3 times a month at a rate of over 54% of them. Well, that is not too shabby, because they don't have young children in the home. So, moving on. Then this happened. So we're moving on. What happens when you do lose a partner? So you've had a long-term relationship. You've been in a relationship for a long, long time. And then your partner dies. This is what happens what happens when you lose intimacy at that age. After a lifetime of intimate relationships, what happens when you lose it? Well, terrible things happen when you lose it. Men are at increased risk of depression. Men and women who lose a partner are both at increased risk of depression, but men are more likely to get depressed than women. So they both are at risk, but men are even at more risk for depression. Women are especially at risk for poverty. They also get depressed, but they're especially at risk for poverty because often it's the man who had the health insurance, who had the retirement plan, who had the income. Is it easier if the death is expected? You don't want to be in this situation. But if you had to choose, would you want your partner, your lifelong partner, to die on the tennis court suddenly like that? Or to get a chronic illness and waste away, but you have time to prepare and say goodbye and hold their hands when they go? I'm not asking you to vote on it, but people have done research on it, and here's the answer: it doesn't make any difference. It isn't easier if the death is expected or sudden. It sucks either way. Does the nature of your relationship make a difference? In other words, if you had a person that you loved, a good relationship your whole life, and it ends, is that easier or harder than if that irritating person that you were fighting with for so many years finally kicks the bucket? Well, here's the answer to that. Maybe counterintuitive. Prior relationship does make a difference, a big difference. And people cope better if it was a better relationship. It's harder to cope with the loss of someone that you fought with than it is to cope with loss of someone that you loved well. We might speculate on why that's true. Unresolved issues. If you have all this anger and now you have no one to aim it at, it's harder to lose someone that you had a bad relationship with. It's easier to lose someone that you loved well. Does the death of one predict the death of the other? There's the image of this couple that's been together for years. One person dies and the other person says, well, then I don't wish to be alive anymore and I fade away too. Is that true? It is true, to a degree. In later life, when one partner dies, the other person has an increased risk of dying within 6 months. After 6 months, the increased risk goes away. So after 6 months, if you haven't followed your partner into death after 6 months, then your risk just goes back to whatever it normally was. But still, there's an increased risk. So there is a real measurable tendency, small but measurable, for the death of one partner to predict the death of the other. There's an implication for all of this. And the implication is, the implication of this entire lecture is, Intimate relationships don't just affect themselves, they affect the entire trajectory of our lives. In fact, they are the foundation of what it means to be alive and human. And if that's true, then we are highly invested in having the best relationships we can have and understanding what makes them succeed or fail. That's been the question of the whole course. On Wednesday, we will answer that question.